One of the pressing, even grand themes of 21st century creative writing is the ubiquity and effects of migration. This is understandable in cases where the writer has had direct experience of some sort, is perhaps a migrant, her or himself. How to also conceive of migrants as readers, however? How can they be inscribed into the literary world when at the present moment we have something like 100 million refugees around the world? Our first panelist is David Anuar, here to my left, from Mexico, the author of 5 books and 2 chapbooks. His poetry examines topics of identity, history, family, bullying, and new masculinities, as well as tourism. He is highly engaged in rescuing the local history and literatures of his region, Cancun, Mexican Caribbean. He also teaches courses on creative writing and academic subjects at Colegio Universitario Angloamericano in Mérida. His participation in the Fall Residency is made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Next to David is Yahya Ashour, a Palestinian author of an award-winning children's book, You're a Window, They're Clouds, which reflects how he views the relationship between individuals and society. His writing focuses on his perceptions of living under the Israeli occupation in Gaza and how it affects him. He has taught creative writing and literary skills to both children and adults at various community organizations in Gaza. His participation in the Fall Residency is made possible thanks to the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Our next panelist, Tuneg Onder, is the German founder of the award-winning blog Migrant Town, a digital playroom for marginalized perspectives. Her interdisciplinary work locates itself between literature, curational practice, and performance art, and mostly reflects on themes of racism and social disparity in post-migrant Germany. In addition to her 2 books, Migrant Town and Judges, she has published work in nonfiction and poetry anthologies. Her participation in the Fall Residency is made possible by the Max Kade Foundation. Our final panelist is Gayeth Almadoun, a Palestinian, Syrian, Swedish poet and poetry filmmaker who now lives between Berlin and Stockholm. He has published 4 poetry collections in Arabic, and his work has been translated into dozens of languages. His latest collection is Adrenaline 2017, long listed for 2018 Best Translated Book Award, and his film Evian won the 2020 Zebra Best Poetry Film Award. His participation in the Fall Residency is made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Embassy in Stockholm. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Is it okay? Yep. Okay. So I'm going to read the paper I wrote, and then we can speak a little bit more. More than readers, I went into the way of writers, and also I explore a little bit about my life and my background as being both of my parents are migrants. You will see it right away. Migration, the face of a city. Roots. At some point in our life, we start thinking about them. As a child, I heard my mother had been born somewhere else, maybe in a nameless town near the capital city of Mexico. The mother of my mother also came from a different place, a little minor town amidst the mountains filled with pine forest and monarch butterflies. Angangueo was the name, and for me, it sounded like a legend. And if I dug a little bit further, I will discover my indigenous heritage, a great-great-grandmother who was a Masawa. The story was not any different on my father's side. He also hadn't been born in my hometown, Cancun, and if I dug far enough, another indigenous ancestry, Anawa, would appear. Filiberta, my great-great-grandmother. My father and his family were from Acapulco, Mexico's first city dedicated to sun and beach tourism. They were penniless and wanted new opportunities. In our talks about this, he always tells me that the name of Cancun started sounding like a rumor, like a remote place where you could start over and change your life, your economic situation. That is how my father and his elder brother decided to migrate on the 26th of August of 1974. Back then, Cancun was still a young city. Founded by the Bank of Mexico, it was formed by a couple of hotels and two dusty roads surrounded by the jungle and crocodiles. The living conditions were harsh. No hospitals, no schools, no entertainment, no market. Everything was to be made. Migration has been part of literature in ancient times. The tales of the Jewish people in the Bible, the Homeric adventures of Odysseus, the tales of the Aztecs in the Tovar Codex, and how they migrated from Aztlán in search of a new promised land, Tenochtitlan. But migration is not just part of history or ancient literature. It is still a deep and significant human experience that affects thousands of hundreds of human lives nowadays, whether they are struggling with warfare, economic, political, or social issues such as narcotraffic. In this case, Mexico, we're living a lot with this. Literature still talks about migration as an individual and self-discovering experience linked to identity and adaptation. For example, Jamaica Kincaid's novel Lucy or Marjan Satrapi's graphic novel Persepolis. But also, literature has addressed migration as a social issue, as depicted by Juan Rulfo in Paso del Norte, included in his book The Burning Plain. In this short story, the author displays the poverty of a middle-aged man who tells his father he will go up to the north, the United States, of course, in search of work. The specter of the son comes back to tell the father that he was peppered to death with bullets while crossing the river. This social phenomenon has also found voice in recent Mexican poets, such as Balam Rodrigo with his Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos, Central American Book of Death, and Armando Salgado's Red Border, both depicting the horrors of Mexican and Central American migrants who have been butchered in the train called La Bestia, the Beast. And I want to read a fragment of Balam Rodrigo's book. He who wants to follow me to the United States, leave his family, abandon the maras, the violence, the hunger, the misery, and forget the infamous caciques and oligarchs of Central America and follow me. And even as he fall, even before the mutilations, before they took him to the morgue in pieces to be buried in a mass grave like any other Central American, as the hundreds of migrants that every year die butchered in Mexico. I don't want to talk about the horrors of migration, which are very well known. I return to my birth city and its peculiar migration process, where the intimate and the collective blend into one. Everyone in Cancun is a migrant. There are no natives. The city was founded in 1970, and before that, it was an unspoiled landscape, where only a ranch of coconuts existed, miles and miles of dunes and palm trees. After that, migrants, such as my parents, started arriving. Therefore, Cancun does not have a long history nor a strong identity. The only common ground that the inhabitants share is migration. So for us and our local literature, migration is some sort of cornerstone, the collective myth to build our history. One of the first authors, a migrant, of course, to talk about this in his poetry was Miguel Ángel Mesa, originally born in Mexico City. I would like to end with a fragment of his poem, 10 Strokes for Another Mask, collected in his book, El Rostro que Habitamos, The Face We Inhabit. So I'm going to read the poem. You walk in the city and you do not recognize yourself. Its mirrors do not recognize you. Its concrete mangroves, its skies within the reach of the hand, the air with its humid skin, the blinded light of so much light. Everything floods your still foreign eyes. Nostalgia sprouts in every corner, as if stones here just born resonates in your step from far away that still you can listen. Unfair compared to the splendor that it's given away, versus the morning that opens its fan like a new peacock. Who are you before these smells of warm, ripe fruit in the humidity? Faced with this, laughter of sun and fermented salt in the Caribbean, in the face of this renewed loneliness, you try to find yourself. You only see the gesture of your mask, nostalgia of your nostalgia. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? I don't want your peace. I want justice. Nakba in 1948, as Zionists were occupying Palestine and creating Israel, my grandfather was forced, together with other Palestinians, to leave Beersheba, a main city in the Negev desert. He lived there until he died. A main city in the Negev desert, south of Palestine, where he lived and worked. He ended up in Gaza, which was not yet occupied. He lived there until he died. I wasn't born yet, but I always heard my father talk about my grandfather's stories in the desert until he died too. My father inherited the refugee status, and I inherited that from him, and I wish I wouldn't have to pass it down to my children. Ben-Gurion, the primary founder of Israel, once said, referring to Palestinians, "The old will die and the young will forget." 74 years later, he continues to be proven wrong. The 800,000 people who were forced out of their Palestinian cities and villages became around 6 million people today, living around the world. They have not forgotten, and they are still identified as refugees. I, for one, wish that I can forget. But how can I forget when I'm always, and by always, I mean every moment, reminded of the Israeli full list of crimes and human rights violations against Palestinians, against me. Continuous state terrorism by their defense army and police, settler colonism, apartheid and racism, ethnic cleansing, and Judaizations of everything. How can I forget when most of the time I was scared for my life of their continuous, heavily armed military aggressions, assassinations, imprisonment, and the bombing of houses, hospitals, farms, mosques, and libraries. When I am living under siege, where I can't always find water, electricity, gas, reliable internet access, jobs, high quality food, or goods. The list goes on and on. It sounds almost unbelievable, and I think that is the point. Israel has no red lines or limits, and its oppression has gone beyond the human's imagination and ability to process and sympathize. It's all funded and supported by the nowadays soft and kind white supremacist colonizing powers, the US and the EU. Since the first day I arrived in Iowa, whenever anybody asks what it is like to live in Gaza, they always have the same follow-up question. Have you considered living somewhere else? I always get overwhelmed by this question. I find it, as innocent as it is, somewhat offensive. Do these people think that this thought never came across my mind? The question only puts pressure on me, the oppressed, to take action and free myself from misery. The question does not cause nightmares to the oppressors, and it tries to innocently free the already free people who are watching from their responsibility to do something to help make change. But I always hold my frustration because I'm always worried that I'm going to scare away people, possible supporters. I'm always worried that I'm going to sound like too much for their free ears. I just find myself explaining over and over how hard it is to just leave everything behind. Your parents, family, friends, childhood, house, language, books, souvenirs, and your ambitions there. How hard it is to even leave Gaza. How we leave when we are permitted to leave. How hard it is to make Gaza leave your mind when you leave Gaza. It never does. I inherited one refugee status, and I don't want to pass down 2 of them to my children. I'm 24 years old. I survived 5 wars and countless Israeli attacks on Gaza. I lived my whole life under Israeli occupation, including 15 years under siege and still counting. I don't know if I will ever taste freedom and justice, but I can't afford to lose hope. I have no other choice. When people ask me what it feels like to survive all of this, I don't know how to answer. One day I have anxiety. One day I have depression. One day I have to deal with trauma, and the next day I have the whole package delivered to me by the Israeli military to protect Israeli taxpayers, who are all necessarily illegitimate settlers, all living in a stolen land from the Palestinians. For every Palestinian who leaves, there are probably 10 new Zionists who didn't need to leave wherever they came from, arriving in Palestine to settle as Israeli citizens. They don't only take our resources, but also our lives and dreams. Today, Palestinians around the world are calling for boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning Israeli businesses, culture, and academia, in hopes to put pressure on the Israeli government and Israeli settlers to end the occupation and give full justice to the Palestinians. This is how the world is acting to stop the war in Ukraine. But can the world give us the same care package? Or do we have to change our skin color? Only those who don't suffer from all kinds of Israeli Zionist oppressions on a daily basis will continue to see Israeli settlers as normal citizens and Israeli culture as culture. And they will also have no problem with the two-state solution that is supported by the white powers of the world. These people don't speak for us and can't tell us what we can and can't think. Peace can never be achieved before justice is. Palestinian people are now asking for their full rights in the land that belongs to no other people but them. Because whenever Palestinians were asked to tone down their demands, they are forced to lower their demands some more and are given nothing but more misery and more disrespect. This is what happens when the oppressor is giving a platform to justify its doings. For years, Palestinians have been forced to be silent, and they are still not well presented by the BBC, CNN, and the New York Times. They are being censored on social media platforms. But here I am, speaking truth to power. My silence will bring me nothing but shame, and speaking up has consequences. At least I'll face them with my dignity. I know this one day will come when Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. As a refugee who doesn't want to be a refugee again, I feel it very hard. I find it very hard to resist the heaven that I'm living now. But I also find it extremely overwhelming not to have something to worry about. This calmness and greenness, this beauty somehow feels more painful than war. I ask myself, isn't it torture to leave prison only to find that you have to go back to it soon? But without this torture, nobody would learn about the prison I came from. I hope people will still remember my message, and I hope my poems will still reach you when I go back to the biggest open-air prison in the world, Gaza.
Okay, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Do you hear me? No. Yes? Okay. Woohoo! Now it's better? Which, where, how?
We can hear you.
Okay. I will shout.
They're all
Okay.
on. They're all on.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yes, yeah, sometimes that happens to me that I fail to answer the questions. This happened this time maybe as well, but you will see yourself. Migrants and monsters. Migrants as readers. Who is that supposed to be? Maybe people without nose, or even people with a third eye on their middle finger. Little monsters? Probably. Luckily, some politicians help us to make up our mind about migrants. None other than the former German Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer, proclaimed publicly a few years ago, the mother of all problems is migration. Migrants seem to be real troublemaker. But how could it come so far? A short review. Back in the early 60s, as a result of Second World War and the Holocaust, Germany was in desperate need of people who could ensure its economic development. Bilateral agreements between Germany and dozens of other states were made. A giant mass movement started. Only the most efficient people were selected. During that time, over 1 million workers from Greece, Spain, Portugal, former Yugoslavia, Turkey, Tunisia, and Morocco came to Germany. My father was one of them. They are known as guest workers, Gastarbeiter in German. They built colonies inside the state, ensuring the economic recovery of Germany by doing the hardest physical and harmful work in factories, mines, or in road and house construction. At the same time, living in segregated settlements and lodgings with almost no participation in social or political life. The deal was meant to be a win-win situation for all parties. Germany had cheap and willing workforce. The workers, in turn, got the chance to make several times more money than they would in their home countries. They would make money and hopefully piss off back, soon go back where they came from. Well, the math did not add up. Unfortunately, the workforce were people and not machines. Nobody had expected that. It was a writer, Max Frisch, one of us, who had to remind the Germans that we sent out a call for workers but got people. These people really wanted to have a life besides work? Unbelievable. They wanted to love and to be loved. They wanted to have families, their own apartments, a car, a radio, a television, and maybe even a skateboard. Besides, it was not possible to save enough money to build a basis for a better life upon returning home. That was just one of those fairy tales of capitalism. Long story short, some of these migrants actually managed not to die after retiring. Some of them even remigrated, but a lot of them just got stuck in Germany. So here we are, migrants, most of them not even migrants anymore. They just inherited the migration status of their parents like I did. We all live in Germany. So the question is, are we a special sort of readers? Is our toothache, hunger, and loneliness a different one? I doubt it. But of course, there's a little but crucial point with migrants and their descendants. They are forced to be a pain in the ass of those who still believe that Germany is for Germans by blood only. Unfortunately, a long time ago, Germany transformed into a migration society, and it's the honorable duty of us monsters, with and without nose, to make this secret public. And that is a task for writers, of course. Does it work? Yes, it works. This year, just a few days ago, an absolute novelty in the routines of literary world in Germany occurred. The Georg Büchner Prize, coming along with €50,000, is a prize is a prize given annually to German writers since 1950. Usually, it is given to men, only 12 times to women, and not once to a writer with migration background. This year, however, this prestigious prize was given not only to a German-Turkish writer, but a woman on top, to Emine Sevgi Özdamar. Özdamar, who came as a political dissident from Turkey to Germany during the 60s, was one of the first writers who began dropping Turkish-German words in her novels without being censored by editors and publishers. She used neologisms from these communities, special words compositions valuing the speaking world, the lives and realities of migrants in Germany. Awarding her work with such a prestigious prize makes at least one thing clear. Migrants, and those who are still labeled as such, are putting themselves gradually from margin to center by writing and reading. And it seems that for some institutions of the nation state, these people are doing really good work. What else can I say than Mashallah Germany? After half a century, you started realizing this transformative power of your sweet little monsters.
So I'm really overwhelmed after these wonderful papers. I really agree with what Yahya say, 100%. I don't have the chance to say it because I don't live under the occupation. I would like to add that the 800,000 refugees, if you count them, they are 13 million now, because even the people in Gaza and West Bank, where there are 5 million or the 2 million in Israel, they were displaced, so they lost their houses. So we are, in fact, 13 million refugees. But yeah, I can't speak while Yahya is here, because I'm so privileged to born in Damascus. I would like to speak specifically about one Palestinian reader. He was really, when he read, he make a damage in the Western literature, a very good damage. Exile is not a place, it is a space-time. Let's imagine what literature might look like if Hannah Arendt hadn't escaped the Nazis. Joseph Brodsky hadn't fled the Soviet Union, and Edward Said had not been forced to leave Palestine to the USA after the Israeli occupation. Let us imagine the history of literature without exile. When Said was reading Western literature, he read it with excessive sensitivity and clear literary intelligence. His genius way of criticizing colonialism, which is the background of Western culture, speaks truth to the power. When Said was criticizing Western literature, he was criticizing racism, colonialism, colonial history, post-colonialism, stereotypes about the Orient, cliches, preconceptions about other, superiority, and demonization of them, digging into the text backgrounds, the centers of powers of that time. In another word, or in other words, he went through Western literature as a reader, specifically as a Palestinian reader, which was not only unique, but was crucial to criticize Western literature of that time. Being a Palestinian and a Palestinian reader is a combination of being outsider, exiled, immigrant, stateless, vagabond, displaced, nomad, and refugee. Being a Palestinian reader frees you from all the chains that bind the hands of the others. It liberates you from the compromise that many writers are accustomed to in order to maintain their positions. You have nothing to lose after you lost your country. We even knew before Said that many people saw Western literature as a superior to the margins and centered on itself. But he makes us realize that knowledge is not innocent. At that time, he was not only a reader, but he was the only reader. Western centrism. When you are in a room with a lot of light, and here I describe the Western civilization, it's really lighted, and I respect it so much. The literature, music, symphony, philosophy, it is real light. We are really enlightened civilization. When you are in a room with a lot of light, it became difficult for you to see the outside or outside your window. You should approach to the window and try to stick to it, and maybe then you will see a little of what is happening outside. The problem is that the most of the time you will see your reflection in the window. That's you looking to yourself. The necessity was obvious. The outsider comes from the margins, skeptical about what is agreed upon and shaking what is taken for granted in the center. To be the outsider, not outsider. When there are 4 people playing cards, each of them are able to see his own card, and they can't see the other 3 people's cards. When a man enters the room and he goes around the 4 men, he can see all of their cards. However, he cannot play with them. The need of exile. Exile is essential to literature, and Western writers enjoyed exile until the wars and dictatorship in the West ended after the Second World War. Given the importance of exile for literature, Western writers found themselves in a dilemma. The solution was to invent literary grants, residencies, scholarships, and culture exchange program like the one we are here. So writers can voluntarily be exiled to compensate for the real exile that disappeared after the end of the Second War. Anti-tolerance. No one should be tolerant for anyone, because that makes one superior to another. Everyone should be equal. And the only scale to measure that is by the right of criticize. The right to criticize. The most critical challenge for an immigrant is the right to criticize. The moment you criticize anything, the white man tells you, go back to your country. Let us remember who throughout history was forbidden to criticize. The natives facing colonizers, slaves facing masters, Palestinians facing Israeli occupation, Jews facing Nazis, women facing patriarchy, and now immigrants. Me. I, Palestinian, Syrian, Swedish. As a Palestinian, Berlin is a refuge. As a Syrian, it's an exile. As a Swedish, it's a tourist destination. No, it is not simple as that. Let us repeat. As a Palestinian, Berlin was forced refuge after being born as a citizen of a country under occupation. It then turned into exile. As a Syrian, Berlin started as an exile to flee the Syrian dictatorship, and after the start of the Syrian revolution, it turned into a refugee. As a Swedish, it started as a tourist destination and turned into a voluntary exile to flee the winter, the darkness, and the reflection of darkness on people. Born in exile in Damascus to a Palestinian father and Syrian mother, I inherited exile from my father the moment I was born. I had to flee later to my own exile, running away from the dictatorship in Syria in 2008 and successfully going to Sweden. When the Syrian revolution started in 2011, I stood for it. However, physically, I was far away. For the first time, I faced the reality that I was not there, not here, not there, but I was in the parallel. Poems that express exile, written in exile, will demolish the borders between what is private and what is not. The poems became a mirror. Exile turned out to be my space, and the post-war era became my time. In this space-time, poetry is the only thing I can trust to protect my individual voice in front of this collective pain. Exile is not a place. It is a space-time, as Einstein say about it. Here is my double exile. A stateless child born in Damascus inherited the exile from his Palestinian father and choosing his own exile to escape the totalitarian regime in Syria. I am not Palestinian Syrian like before, but I will never become 100% Western. I'm stuck in the parallel. In Palestine, they call me the Syrian Swedish. In Syria, they call me the Palestinian Swedish. In Sweden, they call me Palestinian Syrian. Thank you so much.
What a dazzling set of presentations. Before we open it up to questions, and I hope you'll wait for the microphone to come to you so that our audience at home can hear what's said, I want to point out a couple of some upcoming events. Join us later today at 5 o'clock for our weekly Shamba House reading, this week featuring Waters Yudana from Ghana and Marcel Oku from Benin. On Sunday at 4 o'clock, come to our weekly reading series at Prairie Lights Bookstore, where the writers Pavla Huravkova from the Czech Republic, Kari Baraka from Kenya, and University of Iowa MFA candidate in fiction David DeGusta will read from their work. Our next Cinematheque event is this Sunday at 7 o'clock in the Adler Journalism Building, room 105. We will be showing poetry films curated by Gaeth and the film Born in Gaza presented by Yahya. And please join us next Friday for another presentation from our writers. The panel topic will be in translation. So open it up for questions.
Thank you. I'll start it off. I hope my question is not too intense in any way, but I want to ask that, like all of you, do you believe that people who are from a more disadvantaged or troubled region have the responsibility to stay there and fight the war and fight for freedom and fight for justice instead of moving to a more developed country? Do you think it's their responsibility to do that, or they also have the right to choose their own life? And you might phrase it as escapism in some way, if you disagree with it, of course. Thank you.
No one want to answer?
Should I start? Yeah. Well, in my case, I mean, in Mexico, we don't have like a declared war, but we have like this like undercover war against narco. And each time it's advancing, it's like entering new cities and it's consuming new cities. In my case, I was born in Cancun, and for many years, Cancun was a very safe city. All my childhood, I mean, you could leave the door open, you could play outside, nothing ever really happened. I could even go by myself to the beach, We had that type of freedom, and it was beautiful. When I turned around 20, I had to leave my hometown to study, and I had to move to another city that was 300 kilometers from Cancun. Cancun doesn't have much of university, nothing like that, So I was like pursuing a different type of life. I wanted to become a writer, so I was forced to leave my city. And when I left, strange things started happening in Cancun. Like you started to hear or see in the news, there was a shooting in this place, or there were people who were beheaded, and the narcos started like taking the city over. So there are several cases in Mexico, cities that have been taken by the narco, even areas that you cannot go in. So I don't know, it's very difficult to, I mean, if you stay, you won't be able to fight narco, The Mexican state cannot fight narco. Why should I remain there? So for me, I decided to move outside my city, not because of narco, but because I wanted to pursue other dreams or my writing. But then, when nowadays I ask myself, would I go back to Cancun to live there? My answer is no. No, because it's a very insecure place. So I think it's not my responsibility to fight that war. It's not my war against narco, I think Mexico has to do a lot about its policy, about its narcotics policy that we are not doing, and the politicians don't want to do anything about it, but I think it's not my responsibility. But still, if I can do something through what I write, I will try to do it. So that will be my answer.
Okay. Thank you for your question. For me, I'm always conflicted inside myself. Should Palestinians leave and live somewhere else, or should they stay if they can? But the way the question never leaves my mind. I of course want to live a beautiful life, but I want to live a beautiful life in my country. And the way I still see it till now, there's something that's like very devilish about the Israeli occupation, is that they're not, so they divided the Palestinian people into like different miseries, if that makes sense. So Gaza's under siege, the West Bank is full of settlements, and the Palestinians who still live in the occupied lands are facing like, they are being treated less than second-class citizens. And there are like so many refugees, like Riyadh. So each one has their own face of occupation, and sometimes there are common faces of the same occupation, if that makes sense. For me, as someone who's still there in Palestine, the way I think about it, if I ever left, is that Israeli settlers will basically send me a thank you note, because some Jews around the world will come and become Israelis and Zionists. So if I left, someone else is going to take my place, and I will never be allowed back. But in other countries or in other conflicts, if you leave, no one will take your place, maybe. But for me, because it's a conflict of existence. They come from Europe, from the US, from so many countries. These countries are like, nobody wants to leave the US, or nobody wants to leave Europe, but they still come to Palestine till this day, and the Israeli government really helps them in doing that. I remember something, and I want to make sure I mention it, and like the mentality of settlers, the Israeli settlers. So there, just recently, an Israeli settler was caught on tape last year. A Palestinian was talking to him, and this Palestinian girl, so this Israeli settler basically lives in the other half of the same house. So the Israeli government stole one half of the house, of a Palestinian house. And this Palestinian woman is talking to this settler who's living next door to her, stealing the other half of her house. She tells them, "You stole my house. You should get out." And the Israeli settler basically just replied, "If I don't steal it, somebody else is gonna steal it. So if I handed the house away, the Israeli government is gonna basically give it to another Israeli citizens." And they are always looking for new settlers. So, and they used the war in Ukraine in that regard. So there are many Jewish people in Ukraine, and once the war happened in Ukraine, Israelis were like, the Israeli government were like, "Oh, there is another place that you can go. You can leave Ukraine and come here." And the thing about settlers living in Palestine, they are being protected on the account of our blood and our safety. The government keeping them safe on our account by killing us, by imprisoning us. So it's really a complicated question. If I leave, and if till now I find it, I can still find meaning in my suffering, and this is very important. Not many people know how to find meaning in the suffering and how to hold on. And as I said in my paper, I can't afford to lose hope, because once I lose hope, I don't know. I just, so, and I want to bring another point also to the discussion.
Yahya, later. Let's
Just
yeah,
one last
but,
thing.
Yeah, but you have to speed it up. We've got other
Yeah.
people on
The
the
last
panel.
thing, the last thing. The last point that I want to mention is that I lived here in the US before for 1 year, and I was always imagining, like, would I be able to stay forever in this country? And it was very hard for me to answer this question. There are many pros and cons on both places. So.
Thank you. Tonight.
Thank you. Yeah. I make it very short. never experienced war. That's why I cannot say something to this. But what I can say is I don't have the feeling that I would say Germany is my country or Turkey is my country. So I have both citizenships. Maybe this is why I would never fight for any nation state. And actually, I don't want any country. I don't want to be identified with a nation state. And yeah, maybe, I don't know, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I will try to answer from a literary perspective. First of all, when I was young, I was really thinking to die for Palestine. And later on, when the Syrian revolution began, I was planning to go to Turkey and fight for freedom in 2011 and be part of it. But I find myself a chicken. I was not able to do it. And then I wrote my third book, I Cannot Attend, where I a lot excuse why I cannot attend. My girlfriend is pregnant in the 11th month. I don't have a girlfriend. Nobody will feed the fish tank. I don't have fish tank. All these lies to not go. What I want to say, I was fascinated by a writer, his name, I think, not a very good, it's okay, writer. I think his name, Oscar Maria Graf. And when when the Nazis burned the books, and they mentioned that in the newspaper, he read the newspaper and he find that they didn't burn his books. And it was like, that was like, what? So he began to attack them. And then the day after, of course, Goebbels, he burned his book. But I want to say that is an easy stand. That is an easy stand. But to go and die for freedom, that is another thing. I was really afraid from death, so I escaped it. And if the Syrian people succeed in that time to got the freedom, I didn't deserve it because I was not a real fighter. But what I want to say that we always fight for our things we love. In Hannah Arendt long essay, We Refugees, she described what Syrian people and Palestinians somehow they have. When they arrive, the Jewish refugees arrive to New York, they try to say that we are not refugees. We are immigrant, and they change every sign and like this. And this is a way of catching the life. And this is what happened with me. I was a young man, want to die for Palestine, change the world. Now, as I told Natasha before, I will not die even for my mother. Yes, and I only want to change myself, like that's like to be better. So I know, of course, I will not die for anything. I want to enjoy life. Thank you. Yeah.
Get there.
It's hard to choose, sorry.
As a migrant and a refugee, what are the written works that have most influenced your identity as either a migrant or refugee or as a writer, or helped you to find yourself in your identity as an individual?
For me, it's very clear that answer. It will be the Caribbean literature and the experience, for example, of Aimé Césaire studying in France, and then when he came back to his own country, he wrote a book that it's called, in Spanish es Cuaderno de un retorno a la isla natal. In English, it's like note of a return to my homeland, something like that. So for me, the Caribbean experience of exile, migration, and coming back has been fundamental to understand my own self and my own experience. Another example will be George Lamming novels. For me, those they are like very important to me.
For me, this is so the two very important Palestinian poets who wrote about this experience of being a refugee and experience of exile. And I want to mention two recommendations that, if you're interested, you should read. The first one is In the Presence of Absence for Mahmoud Darwish. And the second book is I Saw Ramallah for Murid al-Barghouti. And his follow-up book is I Was Born There, I Was Born Here. They are very beautiful books, and this is why I'm really interested in memoirs in general, because they talk about their identity, their exile experience, their refugees.
really don't know. I think I was influenced by the newspapers very much, because in Germany, or also by university theories or so, it wasn't a negative influence. Like I read all this and then I thought, oh my God, how they are writing about the others. So this influenced me the most, I would say. And then afterwards, I don't know, more like I'm reading really more like theories or so. That is inspiring me the most, like post-colonial or so, Edward Said, for example. But that began really very late, because in the university we did not really get this to read, and at home my parents practically do not read, so I had really to find this all myself. Yeah.
Thank you. The question is really complicated, and I think we will not be able to finish. But in general, I was thinking about all the different, like, so Albert Camus is French, but born in Algeria. I always put myself in his situation, especially when the Algerian Revolution began to fight, where he will stand. He's Algerian, born in Algeria, but he's a French from Oran. He should leave. And I think this has affected the stranger so much. I don't like what he say when he got Nobel Prize, when he say, if there is fight between justice and my mother, I will stand with my mother. Maybe he meant France. He said to a young Algerian, I'm not sure he say it even, but yeah, Edward Said, I mentioned it. He is really like, he's one of the beautiful-minded of these people who could describe the diaspora and the being in between. And I like Ghassan Kanafani. He's one of the greatest Palestinian writers, and Israel sensed that. So they killed him when he was 36. He only wrote he wrote only 12 years, and it is amazing. He's one of the greatest writers, should be in history, but like in that time they say there's no Palestinian people, and they understand this person will be very famous, and then people will know that there's Palestinian people. So he born 1936. He lived 12 years in Palestine, 12 years in Syria, 12 years in Kuwait. He wrote 12 years. He was having sugar. This is 12 years. And he got killed in 1972 with his nephew. They put the car bomb, and he died with his nephew. He wanted to take it to school. He is really interesting in the diaspora. Wonderful. I like Brecht, especially the radios things he make when he was running from the Nazi Freedom Radio. I think I listened to him, and all what he wrote in Finland and like this. Jacques Derrida, as Algerian, they didn't accept him in West as Algerian. They call him a Jew, but he's a French citizen, but he's Algerian Jew. He's an Arab Jew. And Zixou also, they didn't accept her as an Arab. Both of them, they have this problematic identity. Yeah, many people. I'm inspired by many people, but it is very important for me. Exile and this way of we mixed in the world. It is the motor behind the literature.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and we've only just begun the conversation, I fear. So next year we will have to do a couple of panels like this, I see.
We'll re-invite you.
Yeah. Thank you so very much. Yeah.